Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In last week's podcast, we dealt with part 1 of the resurrection of Lazarus story as narrated uniquely in the Gospel of John, chapter 11. We ended last week's episode with Jesus weeping at Lazarus' tomb, along with his siblings, family, and many friends from the Jewish community. In this week's podcast, we begin when Jesus was deeply moved as he approached Lazarus' tomb, which was in a cave with a stone blocking its entrance. That's in verse 38. Jesus at that point ordered that the stone be removed. Immediately, Martha, Lazarus' sister, protested. She pointed out that her brother had been dead for 4 days, so there was sure to be a stench when the stone was removed. But Jesus did not rescind the order. Instead, he responded to Martha by reminding her that he had told her that if she believed in what he had said, she would see the glory of God. That's in verse 40. Upon his saying that to her, some of the people removed the stone. When that happened, Jesus prayed. In his prayer, Jesus noted that God is always ready to hear his prayers. Then he went on to know that he was praying in this vein so that everyone standing at the tomb would have reason to believe that the Father, to whom Jesus was of course praying, had indeed sent him on his mission. That's in verse 42. As soon as he said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." That's in verse 43. Amazingly, Lazarus emerged, bound as any corpse would be, with bandages around his hands and feet. Plus, when he came out, Lazarus also had a burial cloth wrapped around his face. Jesus at that point issued another order: unbind him and let him go. That's in verse 44. Obviously, that induced many of the Jews who had come to console Martha and Mary to believe in Jesus. That's in verse 45. But not everyone believed in Jesus because of what he had just done. Instead, some of them went to report to the Pharisees what they had just witnessed. That's in verse 46. This report prompted the Pharisees to gather the council, which indicates a group of religious officials in the Jewish community. The agenda involved their response to this sign Jesus had just done. As they deliberated, they were confronted with a dilemma. They recognized that Jesus had been performing many signs, which is the way Jesus' ministry is described in the Gospel of John. They reasoned that if Jesus were to continue to perform signs like this, before long, everyone would surely believe in him. Were that to happen, their reasoning continued, the Romans would not tolerate the situation. The Romans would certainly respond by destroying not only, quote unquote, our holy place, doubtlessly a reference to the temple, but also the Jewish nation itself. That's in verse 48. At this juncture, in the deliberation, Caiaphas, the high priest, interrupted the discussion. He argued that the group did not understand what was going on. That's in verse 49. To back up his argument, he told those who had gathered that it would be better for one man to lose his life for Israel, otherwise the whole nation might perish. That's in verse 50. The narrator then adds a footnote, so to speak. In this footnote, the narrator underscored that the high priest did not say this on his own accord. Rather, he had inadvertently prophesied, incredibly, that Jesus should die not only for the Jewish nation, but to gather into one the children of God who had been scattered abroad. That's in verses 51 through 52. That is most likely a reference to dispersed Jews who had spread abroad in the Mediterranean basin in the centuries after the exile. In a sense, the high priest hit the theological nail on the head. The idea that Jesus' death had a benefit for all Israel and beyond is saturated throughout the Gospels. The high priest articulated that theological truth precisely. Unfortunately, the general reaction of most of the other Jews to this pronouncement was to regard Jesus' death not as a benefit, but as a deficit. According to this gospel, from the time that Jesus called Lazarus to come forth from the tomb, the Jews started to make plans to put Jesus to death. That's in verse 53. Also, from that point, Jesus never went out openly where he might be arrested. Instead, he went to a town called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. Since it was almost time for the Passover celebration, many had gone to Jerusalem for purification. A few wondered whether Jesus would show up for the festival. This was going on after Jewish officials had given orders that they were to be informed should Jesus show his face. They were intent on an arrest. That's in verses 55 through 57 of chapter 11. What should one make of this well-known, incredible story? Even taking it at face value presents difficulties. Lazarus was resurrected, not resuscitated. That is, Jesus did not rescue a man from death so that he would in time have to die again. The whole point of resurrection is to defeat death. His remarks to Martha about being the resurrection and the life suggest that Jesus was thinking of resurrection in the technical sense of the word. But since Jesus had in mind resurrection, Lazarus presents a problem. According to the rest of the New Testament and the Christian faith in general, Jesus is the first one to be resurrected. The rest will follow in the final general resurrection when God creates a new heaven and a new earth. Given this logic, I suggest that the Lazarus story should be seen as a type of midrash. Midrash was a common element in Jewish interpretation. Midrash typically amplifies a story or a belief by supplying details lacking in a particular story or answering questions prompted by a particular doctrine. Here are my reasons for this suggestion. 1. Jesus first responded to the message that Lazarus was ill by saying that his illness was not unto death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. That's in verse 4 of chapter 11. The glory of God and the Son's glorification in the Gospel of John is tied inextricably to Jesus' passion, his arrest, trial, execution, and his resurrection. Raising Lazarus should not be seen as an isolated sign, but as one that had a special connection to Jesus' passion. Had Jesus responded when he was told that Lazarus was ill and came immediately, he might indeed have engaged in a healing ministry. But from the beginning, Jesus related Lazarus' condition to glorification, which in turn involved death and then resurrection. 2. Jesus directly addresses the issue of the general resurrection, in which most Jews believed, and the issue of his own resurrection. According to Jesus, the general resurrection needs to be seen in the context of and enabled by Jesus' own resurrection. He is, after all, according to himself, the resurrection and the life. 3. Lazarus' resurrection mimics Jesus' resurrection. Only in John's Gospel are we told that Jesus had a face cloth when he was buried. That's in chapter 20, verse 7. And so that was something that Lazarus also had on when he emerged from the grave in verse 44 of chapter 11. The same Greek word is used in both instances. Lazarus' resurrection was a proleptic portrayal of Jesus' own resurrection. 4. The very next chapter lends itself to this interpretation. This chapter mentions the incident in which Mary took a pound of costly ointment and anointed Jesus' feet with it, after which she wiped his feet with her hair. When she did this, Jesus rebuked Judas for complaining about this waste of money and said that Mary should keep the rest of the anointment for the quote-unquote day of my burial. That's in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 12. Again, Lazarus' death, burial, and subsequent resurrection adumbrates Jesus' own death, burial, and subsequent resurrection. 5. The newly resurrected Lazarus is present at this pre-Passover dinner along with his two sisters, Martha and Mary. That's in verse 2 of chapter 12. His presence was a problem for the chief priests, since so many Jews had come to see not only Jesus, but the man whom Jesus had raised from the dead. That's in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 12. Because of this, the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because his resurrection presence had persuaded so many Jews to believe in Jesus. That's in verse 11. There is one other story in the New Testament that has this same problem. This story is even more spectacular. I did a podcast on that a couple of years ago, and you can find it listed in my website. In Matthew chapter 27, we are told that when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs were opened, so that many bodies of the saints who had died came out of these tombs after Jesus was himself raised, and subsequently went into the holy city and appeared to many. That's in verses 50 through 53 of chapter 27. This account is unique to Matthew's Gospel. It, too, is a proleptic adumbration of the general resurrection that Jesus' own resurrection made possible. This little snippet is also a type of midrash on Jesus' resurrection. Matthew's general resurrection happening at the same time of Jesus' resurrection, and the resurrection of Lazarus in the presence of a crowd almost have to be seen as twin midrashic elements. If Matthew's general resurrection had been that public, why would anyone in his or her right mind disbelieve? The same goes for Lazarus, a story unique to the Gospel of John. Just as the Gospel of Matthew glosses Jesus' resurrection with a depiction of a simultaneous general resurrection, so the Gospel of John glosses Jesus' resurrection with a midrashic account that underscores that indeed Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Let me invite you to go to my website, faspina.com, and you'll find the podcast listed there, and also indicate to me your email. And if you have questions that you would like me to address in a future Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.